Chattooga Press Audio presents Tunnel Town, a Demon Powers short story by Tony Galloway. Read by Tony Galloway. Kurt followed Officer Santimo into the county morgue, which is to say into the back room of the only funeral home in town. Santimo threw open the cooler door and waved him on. Inside, 6 bodies lay on gurneys, pallor a pale gray only the cold and absence of blood could conjure. All young men, too, not much older than his son. "Your kind of thing?" Santimo asked. Swallowing bile, Kurt examined the bodies one after the other. He could hear the big man shifting from foot to foot behind him. "Gotta be vampires, right? Bodies with no blood." He didn't answer, instead pulling the sheet lower until he found what he was looking for. A wicked gash to the right inner thigh, nearly to the bone. Each body bore a similar injury. "Where were they found?" "Down toward old Jessup's, back in the old mining tunnels." Kurt nodded. "No locals?" Santimo shook his head. "All out-of-towners. Gotta be a vampire, right?" "No such thing, friend," Kurt murmured, as with a grunt of effort he turned the body over and found a strange sigil, almost like a tattoo if tattoos were carved rather than inked into flesh, nearly invisible in the hairline at the back of the boy's neck. "Well, is it your kind of thing?" The urge to lie was strong. Kurt wanted to say no, just a run-of-the-mill serial killer, something for the police to manage. Call in the FBI, whatever. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, and he did not want to spend it hunting down some lunatic. But it was his job, so he nodded. "Yeah, I'll take it from here." The air outside was just as cold as the coroner's cooler, but it smelled better. Kurt started his old truck, fumbled the heater on, and shuffled through the police reports Santimo had Xeroxed for him. Just as he was settling into the work, his phone rang, buzzing like an angry bumblebee on the seat. He picked it up and flipped the mouthpiece down. "Levin," he growled into the receiver. "You sound like you're in a mood." His wife's voice rolled out of the tiny speaker like honey. Kurt softened his voice. "Just got out of the morgue." "Better than staying in, don't you think?" Suppose it is." "Headed home?" "Gonna be a while. 6 dead boys and counting." "Tomorrow is Christmas Eve, and Tyler's big present says some assembly required." "I know, Mary." "Well, don't forget." "I'm gonna have this finished up quick like, I promise." "Be careful out there." "Always. Love you, honey." "Love you too." Kurt closed the mouthpiece and dropped the phone back onto the seat with disdain. No way these things were ever going to replace proper two-way radios. With a sigh, he glanced over the files. There were pictures. That might be useful. Beyond that, there was little to connect the victims. Some were from other places in Tennessee. 2 were on a road trip from California when they went missing. One file contained a receipt that caught Kurt's eye. McRoy's Diner. That made him wince. Because no good deed ever goes unpunished, he technically owned it. The place didn't look like much more than a dive bar from the outside, and that was by design. The windows were plywood, and the glass in the front door was blacked out with paint. Motorcycles stood in a neat line out front along with a few pickup trucks that predated the invention of fuel injection. Kurt's own, much more modern, truck looked a tad out of place. Inside, the decor was much nicer, almost too nice. The front door opened into a small foyer where Lucky sat on a stool behind the counter. Kurt grinned at him. "Long time no see." Lucky, 5'0", with a small shamrock tattooed on his forehead, leapt down and came around the counter to shake hands. "It's been months." "How's the place doing? How are you doing?" Lucky shrugged. "Both okay, I guess." "You want your usual booth? There's somebody in it, but we can fix that," Lucky said, cracking his knuckles. Kurt smiled. No need. How about you and I have a drink at the bar? I'm here on protector business. Lucky nodded, turned, and led them through a doorway into the bar. Kurt nodded to several patrons as they walked through. The bar had been Lucky's, but he'd insisted on giving it to Kurt a couple of years ago in exchange for some off-the-record help with a family problem. Kurt had convinced Lucky to stay on and keep running the place. He didn't really want the bar, but turning it down would have been a slap in the face. Lucky and his people took favors and debts seriously. The bartender, Lorraine, was an aging beauty with blonde curls. She was all smiles, but still seemed to have an air about her, like she might slap your head right off your shoulders if you looked at her the wrong way. She brought their drinks without asking what they wanted, one of the perks of a small town. Kurt plopped the folders onto the countertop and took a sip of top-shelf Kentucky bourbon. Seen any of these young men in here? Lucky furrowed his brow and examined the files and photos one by one. He took a long pull from his stout. I'm not the best with faces. Maybe this one? He stabbed a finger at one of the images. Think Lorraine might remember better? Looking a bit relieved at the suggestion, Lucky nodded. I bet so. Kurt waved her over. Lorraine did indeed have a better memory than Lucky, recalling 4 of the 6 boys. They stick out in my mind because they all said they was meeting a girl here. All of them sat in that same spot at the end of the bar and ordered the Gutbuster burger. Whoever they's meeting never showed. It was the same story over and over. The Gutbuster. Kurt scratched his whiskers and thought he must be overdue for a shave. Any of them finish it? One, I think. Lorraine walked across the bar to the corkboard with several pictures on it, plucked one free, and brought it back. It was a lanky, chestnut-haired kid, and Kurt couldn't fathom where the boy could have put so much food. He wore a sickly smile like he was trying not to throw up, and sported a restaurant bib that proudly proclaimed in bold red letters, I finish McRoy's Gutbuster. One by one, Kurt held the pictures alongside the photos clipped inside each police folder. The third was definitely the same kid. Jason Farmington. So he came alone to meet a girl. She never showed. And then he left by himself? Lorraine cast a distracted glance back down the bar, where a couple of fellows were waiting for another round. Back in a minute. Frowning at the picture, Lucky said, Must be a coincidence that they were here, right? Kurt rubbed the bristle on the back of his head, tucked the photo into the folder, and grunted. No, I don't believe it is. According to the coroner, one of those boys died more than 2 months back, and the most recent victim less than a week ago. These boys are trickling in here one by one to meet some girl, only to wind up dead. Lorraine ducked out back to check on things, code for taking a smoke break, leaving him alone with Lucky. Kurt was feeling a little overfull after finishing supper at the bar. Time was of the essence, some assembly required after all, but then again, he needed energy to solve mysteries. Thinking burned calories. Remember, anybody else comes asking, including the police, y'all don't remember seeing them. Make sure you tell Lorraine when she gets back in from her break. Drawing attention here wouldn't be good for any of us, and it ain't gonna bring those boys back. I'll sort it out. Got it, boss, Lucky said with a mock salute. Then he opened the front door. A farewell was on Kurt's lips, but turned to a startled curse when Lucky planted his boot in the small of his back and kicked him face first into the gravel parking lot. A gentle thwap-thwap, accompanied by plumes of dust in the gravel, helped him understand he was being shot at. With a flicker of effort, Kurt brought up a wedge of energy between himself and his attacker. Shield enough, he hoped, to slant any true shots a few inches to either side. As Kurt scrambled to his feet, Lucky stepped around him with a pistol in each hand, both of which looked near as big as the man wielding them. They roared one then the other in a steady cadence that set Kurt's ears to ringing. He followed Lucky's aim to the tree line and glimpsed a hooded figure break from cover and vanish into the dark woods. Nervous sweat beaded on Kurt's neck as he scrambled to his feet and grabbed Lucky before he could give chase. Don't follow him into the woods. That's what he wants. A chance to finish us with no witnesses. We can't let him get away with taking shots at you. He won't. Trust me. I have a plan, and I need a favor from you. The pickup's tires shrieked in protest as Kurt drove home entirely too fast. Blood and adrenaline hummed in his ears, and he'd rolled the window down to let the chill night air dry the sticky sweat the close call had drawn out of him. The cold was delicious and exhilarating. Someone had just tried to snipe him. That had never happened before. The Protector's mansion loomed up against the night sky. This was the traditional seat of power for the Eastern District Protector. But Mary said it wasn't a place to raise a child. Kurt half agreed. The building looked more like a college lecture hall or an old hospital than a residence. He drove past it, dropped the pavement in favor of a well-maintained dirt road, and took it to the end where a 2-bedroom farmhouse waited. Originally built in the 60s, it had been renovated more than once, most recently last year. The place was dark, but for the porch light left on for him. That was good. Maybe Mary had gone on to bed. Quiet as a haint, Kurt slipped around back and roused Munster from his kennel. He looked 100 years old with the loose, wrinkly skin of his breed, but he was barely 3. Kurt had Munster and all his gear loaded up and was raising the tailgate when a touch at his elbow caused him to jump and spin around. Several pieces of gravel rose from the driveway to pummel his attacker, but then he recognized Mary and let them drop with a clatter. You scared the shit out of me, he half whispered and half yelled. I know, she smiled smugly. Too pretty to stay mad at, he grumbled, but glared another few seconds anyway. I had hoped you were finishing up and about to come inside. I wish. I'm headed to the diner. Some guy took a shot at me from the woods there. I want to have a little chat with him about it. I thought Munster might help arrange a meeting. Mary stepped into his arms and kissed him. She was as pale as the moonlight that flashed in her big dark eyes. Be careful out there. It wouldn't be much of a Christmas without you. Because there's some assembly required? Her laugh was music to him. That's right. She kissed him again and headed back toward the house, casting one last glance over her shoulder before she went inside. Hell of a woman, ain't she? He asked the dog. Then with a sigh, he climbed in the truck and headed back to the bar. Fortune smiled upon him that Lucky had not returned from his errand, which was to notify Officer Santimo that the killer knew they were on his trail and had already made a desperate play. A phone call would have done the job, but this would keep Lucky out of harm's way. Kurt found the shooter's ambush spot by the brass shell casings near an oak tree at the edge of the woods and turned Munster onto the scent. The young bloodhound made 3 full circuits, whined impatiently, and let out a low, long bellow. The leash snapped taut, and they were off through the cold, dark woods. The nearly full moon shed enough light to navigate by, so Kurt kept his old wheat light shut off, but draped around his neck at the ready. They climbed straight up the face of a ridge, almost too steep for 2 feet alone on the frost-slick leaves. Kurt's breath came in noisy gasps by the time the climb topped out, and they began to descend the other side. About a third of the way down, Munster pulled them to the left and onto a well-worn game trail that cut a treadable path in the nearly sheer mountainside. A long, mournful bay rolled across the space between the hills and echoed back from the opposite peaks before fading and settling into the dark valley below. A shiver ran his spine and goosebumps prickled his arms. There was nothing else like this in the world, and Kurt almost wept with the thrill of it. If his quarry hadn't known he was prey before, by God he knew it now. The trail threaded through the mountains, defying the impossible terrain. An owl hooted nearby, a bad omen according to some people, but Kurt didn't hold with such superstitious nonsense. Another few minutes and the trail turned downhill, where the faraway murmur of running water slowly became a low roar that blotted out the other night sounds, though the hounds' baying still cut through it just fine. The path crossed a shallow stream and wound up on the opposite face of the hollow. They splashed through and began to climb, but Munster immediately let out a whine and dragged Kurt back across the way they'd come. "Hey, that water's cold," Kurt hissed at the dog. A quick circuit of the area brought Munster right back to the same spot. Kurt clicked on his coal miner's light, turned the rheostat to the brightest setting, and took stock of the surroundings. They were in the very deepest part of a mountain hollow, where two steep-sided ridges converged. Water spilled off the 30-foot sheer rock face and fell in a steady shower, a curtain of silver gossamer in the beam of his flashlight. A look downstream revealed a lazy trickle of water, but something wasn't right. The stream bed was far too wide for one thing, and the water was standing in places, amid rich black dirt and rotten leaves. Maybe a drought could account for that. It could be that there was usually a lot more water flowing. Kurt tried to remember the last time it had rained, but couldn't decide when that might have been. The water looked quite a bit deeper under the waterfall, but why wasn't it flowing downhill? Munster splashed back into the creek and up the opposite side, working his way up and down the bank. Kurt fed out the leash to let him do it while continuing to puzzle this out. The man he was after came to this creek, but never crossed it. Upstream was a dead end at the waterfall and cliff. That meant he must have gone downstream. There was no other option unless he doubled back on the same trail and then found a way to get off it without leaving a scent. "Munster, come on." Kurt tugged the leash and headed down the wide creek bed. He'd taken 3 steps when Munster gave a mournful bellow and the leash snapped tight and nearly jerked Kurt's shoulder out of the socket. "What the—" Ice-cold mountain water poured down the back of his shirt and ran into his pants. He stifled a scream as Munster yanked him through the waterfall and into a half-flooded tunnel cut into the cliff behind it. The dog let out a defiant bay that echoed painfully in the enclosed space. The walls and ceiling were pick-marked stone. For the first time since setting out on this trek, Kurt felt apprehensive. What if he walked into this hole in the earth and never found his way out again? What would that do to Tyler and Mary? He should turn back. Try to find some local information on this tunnel. "Don't be a coward," a gruff voice growled in his head. It was his father's voice. The sound of the waterfall faded as Kurt paced step after step into the inky darkness. The water grew deeper and spilled into his boots. Within moments, his feet were numb from the cold. A memory came to him then. He'd been a boy, not yet old enough to drive, out helping his pawpaw gather and shuck corn from the garden. The old man was prone to long monologues on various topics, and Kurt often listened with half an ear while his mind wandered away from the rote work at hand. On this particular day, his pawpaw had been on about the Red Ruby Railroad, a new company, well funded by investors, making a fortune in coal, and hell-bent on putting a line right through the roughest terrain of Appalachia in the 1850s. The story went that there was even talk of changing the town's name from Sakala to Tunneltown. This notion being based on the unusual number of tunnels the railway owner proposed to cut through the mountains to ensure swifter transport of coal from mines in the area. They was making good headway, too, his pawpaw had opined, which is more than I can say for you. He gestured with a smile to the half-shucked ear of corn in Kurt's idle hands. "What happened?" Pawpaw had laughed then. "The war between the states happened. Takes young men to dig tunnels, and they was all off fighting. These hills is full of half-cut tunnels, if you know where to look. Gives the bats some place to roost, I reckon. Good thing for us that war happened, I guess. Good for a lot of people, son, but our family has always lived free. There's no chaining Solomon's kin for long. The wise king made sure of that." The ear of corn floated out of Kurt's loose grip and drifted like smoke across the space between him and his grandpa. The old man took hold of it and finished the shucking. Kurt shook his head, clearing the cobwebs of memory. So this was a half-dug train tunnel. That meant it would dead end. The killer had thought to hide here and had backed himself into a corner instead. As he pressed on, playing the light across the surface of the water, Kurt began to shiver. The cold was seeping into his bones. Another 10 paces and movement above caught his eye. Looking up, he saw a few bats, stragglers that hadn't left the roost yet. Ahead, the stone ceiling sloped down and met the water. Dead end indeed. The light played from one end to the other until, behind an outcropping of rock, the shadows seemed to deepen despite the beam. Sloshing closer, he found a square tunnel braced with ancient timbers, sloping up and slightly back the way he'd come. Munster padded over, gave the old mineshaft a sniff, and scrambled into it, baying eagerly. What had he gotten himself into? Kurt mused, scrambling into the old tunnel with a grunt. The chill was in his bones now, and he shivered uncontrollably, crouched low in the cramped space, and fumbled his way after the dog. The path ascended steadily, and the exertion warmed his numb toes a little. Kurt shortened Munster's leash, wanting the big dog close enough to shield if the mystery man popped up ahead of them and began firing again. After what seemed an eternity, the tunnel leveled off and turned slightly downhill. A fresh breeze brought the smells of night, and Kurt knew they were nearing the end. The exit proved troublesome, obstructed by a large and thorny bush with widespread limbs. He fought his way through and emerged onto a hillside with a few bloody scratches for his trouble. The mountains spread away below him, full moon lighting the swells and leaving the dips in unknowable darkness. Munster gave an insistent tug, and they were off again, following another slope-defying trail that wound around the hillside. Wind cut through his wet clothing like knives and set him to shivering anew. The path dumped them into an old railway bed, and other than the occasional log to step over, the way was easy and clear. Moonlight fell full and silver enough to make his flashlight superfluous, and conjured for a moment a vision of his Mary. But there was no time for fawning. Munster tugged him ahead eagerly. They were definitely on the right trail now and moving along quickly. The chill air still cut through his damp clothing, but exertion was warming him somewhat. The rail bed wound down into a wide hollow and disappeared into yet another tunnel. This one looked like it might have been completed. The opening was easily 20 feet high and nearly as wide. His hound lunged for the gaping black maw with an eager bay that echoed crazily. They plunged in at a trot, 100 or so yards on, when the moonlight behind them grew distant and winked out. A new, fainter light glimmered ahead. As they approached, he saw that it emanated from a doorway set in the left-hand wall of the tunnel. A sign on the partially ajar steel door read, "No entrance." Kurt approached cautiously, reining Munster in to stand behind him. His free hand rested on the butt of his pistol as he nudged the door open with his boot. A quick peek revealed an empty corridor. Kurt considered tying Munster up here and proceeding alone. It seemed likely the attacker was just ahead, and the interior of this place with its cement floor appeared to be a utility room. Kurt looked down at the dog, whining with eagerness. He wouldn't have gotten this far without the pup. "Come on, then," Kurt murmured. Together they strode into the dimly lit service corridor. The sounds of the night and trickling water quickly faded to be replaced by Kurt's own echoing footsteps and Munster's panting. At its end, the corridor took a hard right and ended at a flight of steel stairs. Will the weirdness never end? The stairs rattled loudly as they bounded up them. At the top, another door. This one opened onto an old gravel pad, long gone to moss and leaves. Munster dropped his nose to the task, and a deep rumble emanated from his chest. Kurt cast his gaze about, alert for the attacker. It wouldn't do to have come all this way only to wind up shot, or worse, bled out like one of those boys. An image of the corpses flashed through his mind. Gotta be vampires. That's what Santimo had said, but of course there was no such thing. Something, though, had wanted blood on a regular basis. What else did he know? The victims had all been lured to his restaurant to meet a young lady who had never shown up. Instead, they'd eaten the Gutbuster burger and left by themselves, only to wind up dead. All of them had that weird symbol cut into the skin at the base of their necks. That didn't add up. Why would anyone want to drown heartbreak and sorrow in 3 pounds of ground beef and grease? From up here, the moonlit valley below spread out around him, a quilt patched together from fallow cornfields, small house places with their dirt yards, and the twinkling lights of town. Kurt got his bearings and made a rough estimate of where he was in relation to Sukala. Munster gave an impatient whine and tugged against the leash, nose against the frozen ground, oblivious to the growing wind that set Kurt to shivering again in his wet clothing. All right, Kurt grumbled. The trail led down into the tangled forest where the moonlight was quickly muted by the crisscrossing limbs overhead. As the well-worn trail wound down, the scent of wood smoke tickled Kurt's nostrils. Another minute and he paused to let his breathing slow as he peeked through the brush at a small cabin with a brightly lit window and smoke spiraling from the chimney. Carefully, he tied Munster's leash to a nearby pine and knelt beside the young dog. Stay. Hush, he commanded. The hound lay down and with reproachful eyes watched him back away. Kurt ducked across the spot of yard between the tree line and the cabin and pressed himself against a wall without a window. He eased around the corner, scanning his surroundings. He approached the lit window and chanced a quick peek. The cabin was sparse but homey. A wooden countertop with a coffee pot and a few cooking implements, a well-worn rocking chair, and a threadbare couch were arranged near an old-style wood-burning stove with 2 cooking eyes on top. The one-room abode appeared to be quite empty. Kurt sidled up to the door, casting furtive glances across the moonlit yard as he raised the primitive door latch and let it swing open on well-oiled hinges. As he stepped inside, the heat wrapped around him. The adrenaline had helped him forget how cold he was, but now, with the cozy warmth of wood heat seeping through his damp clothing, he realized it. There was a shelf in the corner he hadn't seen from the window, arranged with framed pictures on the top shelf and 3 rows of books below that. Floorboards creaked ominously as Kurt crossed the room. There had clearly been 3 framed photos here once, but the center one had recently been removed, judging by the marks in the dust. The left-hand photo was of a boy and a girl, 15 or 16 years old, he guessed. Wearing old-style trousers with suspenders and a white shirt, the boy had a mop of unruly chestnut hair and eyes so brown they verged on black. With one foot resting on a stump, a roguish grin, and an axe hanging loose in one hand, he was strikingly handsome. The girl stood beside him, his free hand draped loosely across her shoulders. She wore a summer dress with yellow daisies. Her blue eyes made a striking contrast to the cascade of dark curls that framed her face. She had her head tilted slightly, looking up at the boy with a mischievous expression. Their personalities seemed to ooze from the photo. The photo on the right was of an elderly couple. The man wore denim Liberty overalls with a suit jacket. His hair, what little he had, ringed his head in a wisp of white. Age and hard living gave his face the look of tanned leather. His jowls hung loose, but there was still light in his dark eyes. Where the man stooped and slumped, the woman beside him stood ramrod straight. She wore a high-necked, old-fashioned dress, though the photo was full color and had clearly been taken in more recent times. Her pinched expression and steel-gray hair pulled back into a tight bun gave her a severe look. Her eyes were the same flinty blue as the young girl's, but stared out of the photo as sharp as needles. They were clearly related, possibly a grandmother to the girl in the first picture. Kurt peeked out the window. The night was darkening as clouds rolled in, obscuring the full moon. He glanced at his watch. It was almost 3 a.m., and officially Christmas Eve. McRoy's would be long closed. Hopefully Lucky would have delivered the warning to Santimo and gone on to bed. Turning back to the shelf, Kurt examined the books there. Lots of classic horror like Frankenstein and Dracula, and even a Lovecraft anthology, was interspersed with newer stuff like King's Pet Cemetery. An empty cabin with a fire going in the wood stove, as if whoever lived here had stepped out for a moment and never returned. Munster had been headed straight at the front door when Kurt called him off. Kurt surveyed the room again, sparse furniture around the stove, even less to see in the kitchen. That only left the bookcase. No way, he murmured aloud, as he grabbed the shelf and heaved. It slid easily to one side on oiled tracks, revealing a narrow passage with stone steps descending into darkness. How many underground passages would he have to navigate tonight? He debated going back for the dog, but after a moment decided not to. This had to be the end of the chase, the final hiding spot. He patted the gun on his hip to reassure himself it was at the ready, then stepped carefully onto the cellar stairs. The light from above quickly faded as the descent wound down into the mountaintop. Hesitantly, he turned his flashlight on, adjusting the rheostat to cast the palest possible glimmer, just enough to see the next couple of stairs. The air grew colder, and his damp clothes exacerbated the matter. Rueful memories of the warm cabin above threatened to distract him from the task at hand. Stay focused. The stairs ended in a room somewhat larger than the cabin above. Dialing up his light revealed shelves lining the walls, each packed with glass canning jars containing all manner of vegetables and fruits, jams and jellies, some red as fresh blood, others as black as old blood. His mind drifted back to the morgue for a second, and he shook his head to clear those cobwebs away. There were beans, tomatoes, pickles, and all manner of other foodstuffs, enough to wait out an apocalypse. The floor was hard-packed earth, interspersed with stretches of rough stone as if the whole chamber had been scooped out by hand. Maybe it had. A rustling sound caused Kurt to jerk his light up and spin around. There, tucked into an alcove beneath the stairs, was a lone figure. Drawing closer, he saw it was a little boy, younger than 10, sitting in a wooden chair, regarding him with dark, curious eyes. "Hey there," Kurt whispered, voice rough and jarring in the closed space. The boy cocked his head as if the words were foreign. "Are you okay?" "I'm here to help." The child only watched him approach as if in a trance. As Kurt drew nearer, a sinking feeling clawed at his heart. The boy was bloody. The shirt he wore was several sizes too big and soaked red. In contrast to the blood, for the smell made clear that's what it was, a golden pendant lay against the child's chest. It was a Celtic knot woven around a circle. The blood overran the wooden seat on which the child was perched and dripped from his toes onto the floor. Kurt brightened his flashlight, playing the beam across the floor. The chair sat in the center of a gleaming circle of braided metal strands set into the stone floor, glinting silver and copper. There is so much blood. How is this kid still alive? Where is it coming from? As he approached, the boy smiled, a row of perfect white teeth gleaming in his crimson-stained face. "You're gonna be okay," Kurt whispered. He knows that," another voice rasped in his ear. And in the same instant, something heavy struck him in the back of the neck, driving his face into the bloody stone floor. When Kurt's eyes next fluttered open, the dim light stabbed at them like shards of glass. A lurch in his guts threatened to upend his supper. Concussion, he thought. Squeezing his eyes tight until the nausea settled, his head throbbed steadily. "Wakey, wakey," crooned a rough voice. Kurt tried to turn, but ropes crossed his chest and arms and ankles, holding him upright against a rough wooden post. The speaker stepped into view. A man older than Kurt by at least a decade, with curly brown hair thinning and going gray. Dark eyes glinted in the dim light as he stared at Kurt. The man wore the same bloody shirt the boy had worn earlier and was fastening the galluses on a pair of Liberty overalls. He could have been the son of the man in the photo upstairs, or the father of the boy in the other photo, or the father of the boy who had been wearing that shirt some minutes ago, or... It was too hard to think. "It was my turn," the man growled, his words thickened by an Irish accent as he drove a meaty fist into Kurt's belly. "Then, enough of that. There will be another time," a woman's voice called out. Her accent was fainter, but there was a lilt to her words. "Aye, another bloody time," Finn grumbled and stomped away. "Made a big enough mess of things. didn't he? As the woman stepped into view, Kurt struggled to focus his eyes. She was definitely the same girl from the photo upstairs. Brown curls framed a sweaty face, and her blue eyes glinted in the lamplight, though not as brightly as the wickedly curved blade she drew free of a scabbard at her hip with a rasp. Kurt recognized his pistol tucked into the waistband of her jeans. "He's too old for the sacrifice, Levin," Finn protested. "He hasn't even been fattened. You'll waste the other 6. He'll do well enough. Won't you, love? Gave me a fine chase, you and that dog did." Kurt unstuck his tongue from the roof of his mouth and cleared his throat, struggling to gather his wits. "What's this all about? Are you vampires? Holy hell, could Santimo have been right?" Levin and Finn both laughed, and then she said, "There's no such thing." "Then what are you bleeding these young boys out for?" Levin fiddled with the golden pendant that hung from her neck. Kurt squinted. It was the same one that the boy had been wearing earlier. A triquetra, a Celtic knot. "To stay young forever. Or at least, as long as we can." "Nothing lasts forever," Finn agreed absently. "Usually I like the seducing," Levin said, stepping close. "But time grows short. I guess we'll be moving on for a while, Finn and I." She placed a warm hand flat against his chest and leaned in close like she might kiss him on the cheek or just lay her cheek on his shoulder to whisper something. But then he felt the tip of that curved blade slip between his thighs and come to rest on the inside of his leg. Instinctively, he reached for the blade with his mind, grasped at it with his will, but a spike of pain lanced through his skull, and he felt a familiar trickle of blood running from his nose over his lips. "Ah, I hear you're a dangerous man," she crooned in his ear. "But I guess a bump on the head is all it takes to fix that." "Wait," Kurt growled low in his throat. "Wait, damn you." "For what?" she murmured. "I can't stop you. You've got me. Least you could do is tell me how it works. No harm in that, is there?" Levin withdrew the blade and stepped back half a pace. "I suppose not." "Come on, we're wasting time," Finn complained. "From what I gather, you have plenty of it to waste," Kurt shot back. "What's the rush? You have lifetimes to live and I have minutes. Are you afraid of me, even tied up and concussed?" Finn stalked forward like he meant to throw some more punches. "Peace, brother." Levin waved his ire away, gesturing with the blade in her hand. Finn upended a bucket and sat down on it, a look of reluctant resignation on his face. "All right, then, make it quick." "Our family has a long history, Protector Levin. We've books and trinkets from the old world. Dad was a first-rate summoner, and Ma, she was a bit witchy, you might say. I don't know exactly how old they were. It's hard to keep track in our family. I do know it was Dad who found the Crestomon, and Ma who bound it." "The what?" Kurt asked. "We call it the Age Eater," Finn chimed in. "We do," Levin agreed. "It's a demon of gluttony, and when you serve as the vessel for his feasting, he takes some years with him when he goes." Nausea rolled over Kurt. "What exactly is it feasting on?" "The blood of the overfed young. Anyway, the potato famine got Ma, and Dad taught us the practice and stepped off a cliff the next year. He couldn't live without her. Finn and I came to America in 1853, and we do all right for ourselves." She gestured around the room at the jars of preserved foods, as if they were golden idols. Kurt focused on one of the jelly jars and nudged it with his mind. The jar rocked in place. He was rewarded with a spike of pain between his eyes for the effort. Could he free himself and fight his way out of this? Making his best puzzled expression, Kurt asked, "You mean to tell me your parents were immortal, and they died anyway?" "He's an idiot. Why are we wasting our time?" Finn demanded. "'Tis a fair observation," Levin countered. "Well, then why don't you explain it to me?" Kurt let his mind drift down to the ropes that bound him to the wooden beam at his chest and arms and ankles. Unable to see the task, he had to depend on the faint sensation of touch to find the knots. Staying young isn't immortality. If we stay healthy and time the ritual correctly, we can live indefinitely. But car crashes happen, diseases happen. Nothing is forever. Her face took on a wistful look at those last words. Kurt struggled to hold the thread of the conversation while picking at the knots holding him hostage. It was clumsy work, like trying to eat with chopsticks for the first time. Don't you feel bad for all the lives you're cutting short to extend your own? All the families you've devastated? She waved a hand in negation. No matter in the long run. Yeah? Kurt pressed. But what are you two doing with your lives that make the sacrifice worthwhile? Are you curing cancer? Or are you just living in a shack in the middle of nowhere reading the same boring books over and over again, hoarding food, and living off the young like a couple of maggots because of a famine that happened over 150 years ago? Finn stared at him in wide-eyed amazement. I suppose that's enough talk for one day, Levin murmured. The curved knife rasped against the leather sheath as she drew it again. The rope around his ankles went slack, and he turned his attention to the next knot. Wait! Kurt shouted. His voice echoed in the small space. Both of his captors flinched at the loudness of the shout. Wait, he repeated more quietly. Tell me one more thing. I've told you enough. Her eyes were as hard as granite as she approached. The curved blade dangled from one dainty hand while the other hand tugged at the pendant. How does the triquetra figure into all of this? I noticed your brother was looking a lot more spry when he was wearing it earlier. If you took it off, would you turn into the old prune in the pictures upstairs? The knot loosened slightly, but his concentration slipped. Kurt barely dared to breathe for fear he would pull against the rope and retighten the knot. Levin stepped close again, and Kurt felt the tip of the curved blade resting against his inner thigh. The Age-Eater is a blade without a handle. This little necklace helps us use him without getting cut. Kurt fumbled the knot, imagined he could feel his pulse beneath the razor's edge of the blade. Desperate, he blurted out the first thing that came into his mind. Do you have any meat? Meat? Levin raised an eyebrow. Would killing me not benefit you more if I had a meal first? All those other boys had a big meal before you killed them. He's right, Finn interjected. His eyes shone with greed. Make him eat. Levin lifted the blade and Kurt gasped at the sting. A trickle of warmth ran down his leg. He's too old anyway. Then kill him outside. We still have time to find one more young enough. A light dawned in Levin's eyes. A moment of realization. We could finish the ritual tonight. He has a son, about the right age. The hell you will, Kurt bellowed. He lunged against the ropes, and the knot he'd spent so much effort to loosen was jerked tight again. Stupid. Finn untied Kurt from the post and roughly threw him to the ground. Kurt felt a knee in his back just before his wrists were twisted, and the unmistakable sound of zip ties and the pain of them digging into his flesh drove his predicament home. They hauled him, none too gently, up the uneven stairs. He let Finn do most of the work, partly for spite, and partly because he was focused on unraveling another knot. Levin brought up the rear, prodding him forward with bony little fingers. By the time they emerged into the warmth of the cabin, Finn was gasping. Getting old's rough, ain't it? Kurt said sagely, still worrying with the knot he needed to untie. Shut your gob, Finn bellowed. Here. Levin shoved an old-looking rifle into her brother's hands. Get it done, and you might have your turn yet. A greedy glint shone in Finn's eyes. The cold ripped and tore at Kurt's face, and he was quickly reminded of his wet clothing. Snow had begun to fall, and already there was a half-inch of powder underfoot. Finn led him away from the cabin in an unfamiliar direction. Before long, he called a halt and kicked Kurt's legs out from beneath him. Kurt fought the impulse to use his telekinesis to take the weapon from his enemy, remembering how poorly that had worked in the basement with Levin's knife. Instead, he continued worrying at untangling the only knot that mattered as the seconds of his life ticked away. The rope fell away at last. Finn levered around into the chamber with a mechanical snick of finality. Kurt smiled at him, refusing to show fear even though he felt it in every fiber of his being. He pursed his lips and gave 3 sharp whistles. Finn smiled back. "Whistling Dixie, are ye, before you die?" Finn stood over him where he lay in the snow and put the barrel over his heart. "There'll be no wake for you, my lad. Sad, 'tis sad," he murmured, as he tightened his finger on the trigger. Kurt heard the bounding footfalls of his dog. Finn heard them too and whirled, raising the gun to take aim at Munster. Squirming on the ground, Kurt rolled and twisted and drove his feet into Finn's knee. The gun roared, but the shot went wide. Finn fumbled with the lever, but it was too late. Munster hit him like a 100-pound sandbag and drove the Irishman into the snow. A cacophony of snarls and screams ensued. Kurt turned his mind to a new task, the zip ties numbing his hands. Delicately, he shaped his will until he found the tiny plastic lever standing between himself and freedom, and pressed it flat. He was rewarded with pain as blood rushed into numb fingers. Blood stained the white snow where Finn and Munster struggled, the former yowling and striking the hound with his fist, while the latter growled and shook his head, making every effort to rip the man's arm off. Kurt found the rifle where it had fallen, still cocked and ready to fire. He gave a shrill whistle, and Munster bounded back to Kurt's side, hackles raised and a steady basso growl rumbling in his chest. Finn struggled to his feet, and Kurt pulled the trigger. The bullet spun him half a pirouette, and he fell. Grunting with the effort and the pain throbbing behind his eyes, Kurt levered himself upright and approached the fallen man cautiously. Munster paced him step for step. Pain and disbelief twisted Finn's face into a mask. "Can't believe it," he gasped. "All these years, done in by a dog. It was my turn, damn it." Kurt nudged him in the ribs with the toe of his boot. "How did your sister know I have a son?" Finn grinned. There was blood in his teeth. "Not so bright, are you?" "Answer me." "Fuck you." Kurt nodded. It was the response he had expected. "Like you said, it's your turn." He levered another round into the rifle and finished Finn. An inhuman shriek cut through the ringing in Kurt's ears. He whirled to see Levin fleeing back toward the cabin. He whistled sharply and Munster bounded after the fleeing woman, tracking dark stains across the moonlit snow. Kurt reached the cabin only to find Munster scratching at the barred door. He hauled off and gave it a tremendous kick. The simple latch broke free, and the door crashed in, slapping the wall. As unerring as always, Munster arrowed across the room to the hidden cellar door. Levin had slid the bookcase into place behind her. Kurt scooted it aside, and he and Munster descended. The room was just as he'd left it, the empty chair in the circle of blood, the shelves packed with preserved foods. But no sign of Levin. Munster gave a yowl followed by a whine. He pawed at the floor in the back corner of the room, and then looked back at Kurt as if to say, "What are you waiting for?" "What you got, boy?" As he came closer with the light, Kurt saw the outline of a steel trapdoor set into the stone floor. There was a rusty pull ring set opposite the hinge. Grabbing it, he gave a terrific yank. The door didn't budge. He bent his knees and tried harder. Still nothing. "She's locked it behind her," Kurt murmured to no one in particular. More tunnels or just a hidey hole? Kurt wondered. He suspected the former, but just in case, he pushed over one of the great shelves so that it fell across the trapdoor. The sound of crashing jars and breaking glass was deafening in the small space. "Come on, boy. Let's see if we can figure out how to get home before hypothermia gets me. And before Levin gets Tyler," he thought grimly. The snow had picked up significantly. He didn't think there was time to try retracing his steps through all the caves and tunnels. Getting soaked again didn't have much appeal either. Instead, he tried to imagine the path they'd taken. It couldn't be too far as the crow flies, probably only a mile or two. Kurt thought they'd traveled generally northeast, so he took his best guess at southwest and they set off at a trot. His loose-kneed gait ate up the rough terrain as he and Munster descended the ridges and hollows they'd worked so hard to summit. The moon gave plenty enough light that he didn't need his flashlight, and the snow helped in that regard as well. But what aid it gave in illumination it stole back in deception. Everything was softened, smoothed out and obscured. Unseen rocks and holes threatened to turn an ankle. Limbs tripped him, and he worried a cliff's edge might masquerade as a gentle slope. Even still, they pushed ahead at speed, not daring risk any delay. After what seemed an hour, Kurt spotted a glimmer below. Headlights, he realized, winding carefully along an ice-slicked road. He powered up his light and blinked it frantically. Nearly breaking a leg, he and Munster half ran, half tumbled down the bank to the road. An old pickup truck slowed, approaching them warily. They squinted into the headlights until after several uncomfortable moments, the squeak of old hinges announced the driver was exiting the vehicle. "Good way to get killed running out in front of an old man in a snowstorm." "Desperate times, friend. Could I trouble you for a ride? I'm pretty near frozen to death." The driver, still obscured behind the glare of headlights, hesitated, doubtlessly scrutinizing Kurt's tattered and bloody state. "Had a hunting accident. Took a fall. Banged my head pretty good. Probably be dead already if it wasn't for my buddy here." Kurt rested his hand on Munster's head. "Where you headed?" "Need to get home or to McRoy's diner, whichever's closer. Not rightly sure where I am." "Where's home?" Kurt told him. "That's the closer of the two, but I'd venture the hospital might be the better place to head. I need to get home first, check on my family." "You can ride up front, but you'll have to put the dog in the back." "Fair enough." 20 minutes later, Kurt slipped through the front door and closed it gently behind him. The house was silent but for the ticking of a clock and the hum of the heater. Like a shadow, he stole down the hallway on tiptoes. He opened Tyler's door and sighed with relief when he saw the shape of his boy beneath the blankets, silhouetted by a shaft of moonlight that pierced the snow clouds above. Should he continue the chase tonight? His family was here, safe, but threats had been made. Could he chance leaving them now? While his sense of duty to family and oath of office warred with one another, a gust of icy wind set the gauzy curtains to swaying. "Can't afford to heat the whole outdoors," Kurt grumbled as he crossed the room to close the window Tyler had left cracked. He was halfway there when dread and realization struck him like a knife in the chest. He ripped the blankets off the bed and gaped at the pillows mounded there. Something fluttered to the floor. Kurt stooped to pick it up and held it in the faint moonlight. It was a torn picture. The half he held in his hand was of Finn, maybe 30 years old, sporting a roguish grin. He was a big man in his prime, radiating strength and vitality. This, Kurt realized, was half the missing picture from the bookshelf back in the cabin. Thoughts swirled through his head like a snowstorm. Would she have taken Tyler back into the tunnels? Should he wake Mary for her help, or would he only be endangering her, too? Kurt took a breath, then another, steadying himself to concentrate, the way they trained all novice adepts. How had Levin gotten here so fast? Tunnels or not, it was several miles from where they'd been to where he stood now. He'd had the benefit of a ride. Had she? Drifting like a wraith over to the window, Kurt parted the gossamer curtains and looked out at the snow and the two sets of footprints there, one set of boots and the other bare feet. Kurt stalked out of the house. He found Munster where he'd left him, roped to the front post. "Come on," he growled. "We've got to find Tyler." Munster took up the trail easily, and in moments they were loping across the yard and through the adjacent tree line. The trail came to a stop at the winding two-lane. Kurt's flashlight beam played across the snow and revealed the end of the footprints and the beginning of tire tracks. They told a story of a hasty U-turn away from town. There was only one stop in that direction, one hope. If they hadn't gone there, then they were headed out of state. "Come on, Munster." Tires crunched snow as Kurt wheeled Mary's SUV into the parking lot of McRoy's diner. All the lights were on at 4:30 in the morning. His truck was there, covered in snow, and both Lucky's and Lorraine's cars were present with clear windshields. Once more he stepped out into the cold and longed for dry clothing. He patted the place his pistol should have been, regretting having no time to source a replacement. Well, he thought as he pushed the front door open, there's nothing for it now. The smell of fried meat filled his nostrils and set his belly to growling like an unruly pet. He hurried through the foyer and into the dining room. The first thing he saw was Lucky, slumped in a chair, held upright by the thick bands of rope that encircled his body. The left side of his face was mottled with bruising, and a smear of blood colored his cheek. At the bar, Tyler hunched over a plate, his head lowered to the task of eating a gut-buster burger. Twin rivulets of grease shone from the corners of his mouth. Behind the counter was not the brown-headed Levin, as he had expected, but his own bartender, Lorraine. Lorraine. Levin. The names rattled around in his head. How could he have been this dense? "Took you long enough," she said without a trace of an Irish accent. He could see it now in the shape of her face. He moved towards Tyler. "Whoa," she called out, pulling the 12-gauge shotgun from beneath the bar and leveling it at him. "No sense ruining a perfectly good meal." The Irish creeping back in now. "I wasn't counting on you finding your way here so soon. Weren't counting on him showing up either." Levin cocked a thumb at the still unconscious Lucky. "'Tis a night for improvising, I reckon." "Tyler, come on. Get up and come to me. We're leaving now." Tyler gave no indication he heard. His chewing and slurping continued unabated. "He'll not be leaving," Levin crooned. "None of you will." "Let him go, and I'll let you go. You can pack it up and leave town." "Think I don't know your mates will be hunting me before noon tomorrow, if I let you go." The burger was almost gone. A few bites, and it would be done. Tyler hunched over the plate dutifully, and hanging from his neck, almost touching the tabletop, spinning and gleaming in the incandescent light, was the triquetra pendant Levin had worn earlier in the night when she'd still been young. What had she said about the necklace when he'd asked? "The age-eater is a blade without a handle. This little necklace helps us use him without getting cut." Tyler stuffed the last bite into his mouth and chewed noisily. A beatific smile spread across Levin's face as he swallowed it down. Kurt knew this marked the completion of some next step in this whole infernal process. Drawing up the best wedge shield his bruised brain could muster, he lunged for Tyler. Levin pulled both triggers, and Kurt stumbled back against the jukebox and slid to the floor. Levin was saying something, but he couldn't make it out over the shrill ringing in his ears, probably more pointless gloating in her best old Irish accent. His nose was bleeding again, and there was fire spreading across his chest. The shield hadn't been good enough. Levin reloaded the shotgun and set it on the bar within easy reach, and pointed in his general direction. She made a warning gesture at him, had said something else he couldn't hear. Could she hear her own voice? Glancing around, Kurt saw that the shotgun blast had woken Lucky, who was busy struggling against his bonds. The old witch pulled an ancient wooden box from beneath the counter and set it on the bar top. Opening it carefully, she drew out a metal cylinder roughly the size and shape of the shotgun shells she'd just loaded. Smiling almost mischievously at Kurt, she glided up behind the glassy-eyed Tyler and pushed his head forward roughly, exposing the base of his skull. "You will not!" Kurt roared. He tried to rise, staggered, and slumped back down. His head throbbed and his legs were not obeying. She pressed the cylinder into Tyler's hairline, and when she drew it away, a strange glyph had been cut into the flesh there. She dabbed at it with a napkin until the design scabbed over. Kurt ran fingers over his chest and found they came away bloody. The shield had worked some, or his inside bits would have been decorating the wall. But what had gotten through hurt. The sounds were coming back now, and through the ringing, snatches of Levin's voice came to him. "Better when there's more time. Eater likes 8 hours. In the blood. 'Tis a shame." She pulled Tyler to his feet, and he followed like a lovesick puppy. Kurt tried shouting and banging his hands on the floor, but the boy had eyes only for Levin. Gentle as a lamb, she led him to an adjacent wall and pushed him back against it. He stood drunkenly as she deftly unclasped the pendant chain and fastened the triquetra around her own neck. Kurt shook his head, trying to clear his vision, as Lorraine's features turned liquid, and in a handful of heartbeats were replaced by those of the young Irish witch. She rolled her shoulders as if working out a neck kink, and then glanced over at Kurt as she drew the wicked curved blade from a hidden sheath. Lucky let loose a string of Gaelic profanity like nothing Kurt had ever heard before, but Levin, intent on the ritual, paid no mind. With a grunt of effort, Kurt rolled onto hands and knees and tried to rise. The room spun slowly and his vision fuzzed. For a few desperate seconds his heart was a bass drum in his ears. But finally his legs held weight. 2 stumbling steps brought him to Lucky, but Levin had the blade tip nestled against Tyler's inner thigh, and she would draw it across the artery long before he could cross the dozen or so feet between them. Lucky kicked him in the shin, sending a jolt of pain. "Take it, you idiot!" the leprechaun screamed. For a moment, Kurt couldn't figure it out, and then he saw the gleam of chrome under Lucky's jacket. He grabbed it and thumbed the hammer back. A monstrosity loomed at Levain's side, awaiting blood. It bristled like a boar hog, all black, coarse fur, and rippling muscles. But it had an insect's maw, with chitinous mandibles, and a long tube of a tongue that quested about like an elephant's trunk. "Levain!" Shouting hurt his head, but he needed the distraction. The gun roared, and the recoil nearly tore it from his grip. What kind of ammunition was Lucky packing into these things? Didn't matter. The impact sent her spinning away from Tyler. Taking a couple of shaky steps closer, Kurt thumbed the hammer back again and gripped the gun with both hands to line up the killing shot. The demon slammed into him from the side, like a train T-boning a compact car. The pistol went flying, and Kurt was suddenly on his back, straining to hold the abomination at bay as those bladed jaws clacked open and shut inches from his throat. The thing's tongue quested across his face like a snake. Levin appeared behind it, one arm bloody and hanging limp, in the other she had that wicked-looking blade. As if on cue, the monster withdrew its tongue, making room, and the witch leaned over and put the blade across his throat. "It's a conundrum, isn't it? Fight the age-eater and get your throat slit, or fight me and have your face chewed off." Her smug grin kindled a rage in Kurt's belly. He'd have made a witty retort, but holding the snapping jaws away was taking all his strength. As she leaned forward to put weight over the blade, the mysterious pendant swung free of her blouse. The Celtic triquetra gleamed like a golden star, and for half a second it seemed the demon forgot he was there, as if mesmerized. Kurt tucked his chin and twisted away from the blade, toward Levin, making a blind grab. His fingers closed around the pendant and yanked it hard enough to break the golden chain. Her eyes widened in fear. She slashed at his throat with the blade, and there was no time to raise a hand in defense. The demon was quicker. It pounced like a cat on a mouse and bore her down. The hose-like tongue found the bullet wound in her shoulder and disappeared inside. Levin screamed, pounding her tiny fists against the thing's bristly back. Her kicking legs soon only twitched, and then grew still altogether. For long moments the only sound was the slurping, a horrible sound like a toddler determined to get the last few drops out of a juice box. When Levin was as pale and lifeless as the snow outside, the age-eater turned its bloody snout toward Tyler. "No," Kurt whispered, holding the Celtic knot before him like a lantern. The thing glared at him with hateful eyes, the look a prisoner saves for the guard. "No more." There was a brief contest of wills, but it was as Levin had said. The talisman was a handle, a lever to control the monstrosity. The demon turned translucent and began to shrink. In a few moments it was drawn to the triquetra and vanished somewhere inside the glittering gold. Kurt hobbled to Tyler and checked for bleeding. The blade had sliced through the soft cotton of his PJ pants, but the dark skin beneath was unblemished. With the people he loved safe, Kurt sagged into a chair and allowed himself a brief moment of weary relief. Beneath his shirt there was blood, but though he'd need to dig out a few lead pellets, none appeared to have gotten through to the heart and lungs beneath his breastbone. A muffled shout broke through the tinny ringing in his ears. Lucky! He'd forgotten about Lucky. The little fellow was having a fit fighting the ropes and had nearly toppled the chair. Easy, Lucky. I'm coming. Casting about, Kurt came up with Levain's curved blade. It made short work of the nylon cording, and Lucky rubbed his wrists a moment and collected his pistol from the barroom floor. For long moments he wouldn't speak or meet Kurt's eyes. Then at last, as if the words erupted free of their own volition, he said, She tricked me. I'm sorry I let you down, boss. Kurt put a hand on the smaller man's shoulder. Let me down? You saved me. Twice. Saved my boy, too. And you aren't the only one she tricked. A slow smile split his craggy features. We got the witch, though, didn't we? Kurt couldn't help but to smile back. Yeah, buddy, we did. Tyler remained in a daze as Kurt walked him out to the vehicle. Lucky had thankfully volunteered to straighten the place up, which included disposing of a body. All hope of putting his son to bed and praying he didn't remember any of this tomorrow evaporated when the boy said, I almost died tonight, didn't I, Dad? Kurt dropped a heavy hand on Tyler's shoulder. I'd never let that happen, son. I'd do anything to keep you safe. Feels like a dream. More like a nightmare, I'd say. Mom's gonna be pissed. Watch your language. Tyler looked sheepish. Sorry, Dad. She is, though. Yeah, Kurt said, scratching his face. She is. We don't have to tell her, Tyler offered. Tempting as that is, not a good idea. Lies have a way of catching up. They rode the rest of the way home in companionable silence. The sun launched its first rays like spears directly into his eyes as the truck tires crunched onto the gravel driveway. The concussion had devolved into a nauseating headache, and dozens of other bruised muscles and angry wounds vied for attention now that the adrenaline rush had faded. Nothing would have been so sweet as to have crawled into a dark room for a 12-hour nap, but he was far too jittery to sleep. And still, Christmas Eve or not, there was work to be done. As it was, Mary was waiting for them. Her concern seemed to have gotten the better of her anger, at least for the moment. But the way her lips pressed into a thin line as she led Tyler inside told Kurt they'd be talking about this sooner than he'd like. After a hot shower to chase the chill away, he headed for the Protector's mansion. He could have lived there if he wanted, but preferred the familiar family home. There was a doctor on staff, and soon enough he was sitting shirtless and gritting his teeth as they extracted 3 shotgun pellets from his chest. All patched up, he called Santimo and Lucky for a meeting. They joined him in the Protector's office, a large 3rd-story room with plush carpet, a crackling fireplace that finally drove the last of the cold from his bones, and a gorgeous Purple Heart desk. Lucky showed up with donuts and coffee, and Kurt thought maybe the little fellow had done enough for him now that he'd take the bar back and call things even. Santimo came in a few minutes later with his usual grin and good cheer. He gave Kurt and Lucky a once-over and then declared, You both look like shit. It was a bit of a rough night, but thankfully it's over now. They all settled into the stuffed chairs around the fireplace and coffee table. Santimo helped himself to the donuts. So you've solved it, then? There are still some loose ends to sort out, but yeah, I think I have. So, what was it? Kurt told them, but he left out the network of tunnels beneath the town. Those he planned to keep secret and explore. They could be useful in the future. Likewise, he didn't explain the role of the talisman he wore around his neck. The demon was still imprisoned there, though he planned to send it back to hell once he'd had a little sleep. The triquetra was a powerful tool, unlike anything he'd ever heard of, and one day he might have a need for it. Santimo smiled. I knew it. What? Lucky asked. Vampires. They weren't vampires, Kurt protested. They were Irish witches, using a demon to stay young. The big man's smile never wavered. They were hundreds of years old, right?
Yeah.
They entranced or seduced their victims,
Yes, but
lured them to remote places,
it's not that simple.
and took their blood in order to stay young forever.
It's more nuanced than that, Kurt protested.
Vampires, Santimo insisted. Classic case of vampires.
Lucky nodded sagely in agreement. Fine. Vampires. You happy now? The Islander didn't answer, but his annoying grin said it all. Kurt sighed. Back to those loose ends. We have a couple of vampire bodies to dispose of, and Santimo, you've got to decide how we handle the 6 dead boys.
Lucky cleared his throat.
I've already made a plan for our vampires. Kurt blinked. You have? Aye. I've been looking for a new line of business since I gave you the diner. Lucky. After all you've done for me, saving my boy's life, I think we're square. The diner is yours again if you want it. Lucky waved this away. What's owed you can never be fully repaid. Besides, as of today, I'm in a new line of work. Kurt drained his coffee and reached to refill it as he asked, What line of work is that? I've just purchased Mindy's funeral home. Santimo almost choked.
Old man Mindy sold out?
Why the hell would you want a funeral home? Kurt demanded. Mindy's going to stay on and run the place for me, kind of like I stayed on to run the diner for you. At least for a few more years, while I sort out the licensing and certifications. Wow, Kurt murmured. I've already taken care of Lorraine. I just need you to tell me where I can find her brother.
Well, Santimo said, my part in this is not going to be as clean. We've identified the victims, and I think their families deserve to know they died. At least so they can have some closure. He frowned. I'm not sure how to spin it. Can't tell them it was witches, or vampires, or demons. I'll figure something out.
Kurt nodded. Lucky, if you insist the restaurant is still mine, then let's get that gut buster off the menu. You got it, boss. And maybe we ought to be a little more selective about letting normals in, particularly if they aren't locals. I just keep thinking those boys might still be alive if they hadn't gotten through our front door to eat that stupid burger. That's a good idea. Consider it done. They settled into the soft chairs and enjoyed one another's company until the coffee ran out.
Lucky left first with a map Kurt had scribbled on a sheet of notebook paper that he hoped would lead Lucky to Levain's shack and the frozen corpse of her brother, Finn.
Santimo stayed a few minutes more. Kurt thought he might ask for guidance on what to say to the families of the dead boys, but thankfully didn't. There wasn't a good answer anyway. He could feel their hurt like a phantom ache. He'd almost lost his own boy, after all. When at last Santimo left, the fire had burned down to embers, and the morning sun no longer slanted through his windows. His eyes drifted closed, maybe for a moment, maybe for an hour. The shrilling ring of his desk phone dragged him unwillingly back to consciousness. Pressing the receiver to his ear, he was greeted by Mary's voice. Where are you? It's Christmas Eve. I know, honey. The meeting went later than expected. Lots of loose ends, he muttered as he wiped the sleep from his eyes. Everyone's here for the get-together, asking where you are. And I hope you haven't forgotten Tyler's present. Of course not. Some assembly required. I'm headed home now. Kurt arrived home to find his house jumping with activity. Mary's brother Riley sat in a corner rocker, plucking a guitar and singing funny songs to half a dozen rowdy children. Tyler and Mary were bringing out platters of sausage balls, pigs in a blanket, barbecued meatballs, and other finger foods. The room was full of chatting, happy people. Kurt let the noise settle around him like a warm blanket on a frosty day. After watching Christmas movies and feasting on far too many snacks, Kurt's head craved the pillow in his bed. Instead, he slipped away from the hubbub, out to the garage where his breath plumed as he built a fire in the small wood-burning stove. The chill was already fading as he set about unwrapping the pallet in the center of the room. As the paper, cardboard, and foam sheeting fell away, the gleam of blue paint and chrome shone. Mary came up behind him and rested her hand lightly between his shoulder blades. You know you could have paid the power sports store to do the setup. I don't trust them, he grunted. I do it myself. I know it's done right. You sure he's old enough for a dirt bike? I worry. Kurt turned and took her into his arms, resting his face against hers. We wait for him to be any older. He'll be a grown man. Our baby's not a baby anymore, is he? No, honey. I'm afraid he isn't. What's this? Mary asked, lifting the golden triquetra between thumb and forefinger. A talisman. And I hope a good luck charm. She let it fall back against his chest and laughed. There's no luck but what we make. I hope that's not true. I'm going to need all the luck I can get to finish this bike up tonight. Mary smiled at this and pushed the hair back from her eyes. How would you like a little help instead? Kurt pushed her to arm's length and cocked his head, pretending to consider this proposal. Then, pulling her close, said, I'd like that. I hope you've enjoyed Tunnel Town, a Demon Powers short story by Tony Galloway. Read by Tony Galloway. Copyright 2024 by Tony Galloway. Please visit www.tonygallowayWrites.com to learn about other works by this author.